Thank you all very much, and I mean this in the most heartfelt way. It's a privilege to be with Dana-Farber physicians and administrators and nurses and supporters of this great institution. I have a much keener appreciation of the place of these great healthcare institutions in our lives across the country at the end of the last 15 months than I might have had before, even though I thought, with 8 doctors in our family and my interest in healthcare, that I was paying a lot of attention. But of course it was focused by diagnosis in August of last year that I had multiple myeloma. Now, before I get to what it's been like as a patient and some of my observations, I want to put in some appropriate context that introduction. I have 5 grandchildren, and when I was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the White House said, we have a limit on family members. You can only bring 5, and I said, wrong, I'm bringing 10. I'm bringing my grandchildren, their parents, and those are my daughters and my wife as well. And they said, well, we think we can make room. And I said, well, you'd be better, or otherwise we'll have to get that same Secret Service detail on and just storm the White House. So I was in San Francisco recently with my 2 teenage granddaughters, and they call me Tom, all my grandchildren do, because they saw me first on television. So, you know, it's not Grandpa or any of that, it's just Tom. And the 18-year-old said, Tom, we're so excited about going to the White House for the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And I said, I am so flattered. And she said, yeah, I've always wanted to meet Meryl Streep and Stevie Wonder. It is an honor, the likes of which I never expected to receive. It's been a year for me to get Lifetime Achievement Awards, and at one point I said, I'm a little concerned that my cancer doctors are telling these organizations something I don't know at this point. I want to begin by singling out Ken Anderson, who has been so critically important to me. When I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, my phone literally lit up with friends from California and the Northeast who said, you've got to talk to Ken Anderson. That's the man that you need to talk to. And we developed a telephonic relationship right away, things that I thought that I needed to know and questions that I had to have. And I would hang up the phone and say to Meredith, this is a world-class oncologist specializing in multiple myeloma. He could not be nicer. He's more responsive to questions than anybody I've been dealing with. And our daughter, who was listening in, she's an emergency room physician who takes no prisoners when it comes to health care, said the same thing to me. And so there was a time when it was a very fortuitous time. I was happy with my primary oncologist at Sloan, but I thought that we needed to expand the team in some ways when Ken agreed to come on. And it's been not just a wonderful relationship for me professionally in terms of drawing on his expertise, but it's grown into a great personal relationship as well. We'll always have between us Yankees versus Red Sox, Giants versus the Patriots, but we'll work that out. So I just want to pay tribute to this great man who is so modest in his way. I know that I follow Sam Donaldson, who was a speaker here a couple of years ago, I gathered. I had a wonderful letter from Sam when I was diagnosed and it finally became public, and which Sam was a very thoughtful guy in ways that people don't fully appreciate. And he always called me Thomas, and I can almost hear his voice when he wrote me the letter. And he said, Dear Thomas, I know what you're going through now, and there are questions that you're going to ask given all the success you've had in your life, and especially at this stage in your life. He said, I went through this as well, and I had the same questions. The question that you'll always ask yourself, given how well life has gone for you, why me? He said, that's not the right question, Thomas. The right question is, why not me? And in fact, Sam was right. I was 74 years old when I was diagnosed. It was a time when the lottery begins to kick in at a certain age in your life, and things can go wrong and do go wrong. And you're just another member of the human species, and you too can be vulnerable to this attack by this vicious disease called cancer. I had always been very sympathetic to my friends who had had cancer, but I learned very quickly that the world is divided between those who have cancer and have an entirely different view of it and those who don't have it and want to be sympathetic but have no full appreciation of what it's like to have cancer and to be catapulted into that world in which your body turns against you. And so much of it is a journey into the unknown about how it's going to turn out. I will just take a moment to tell you how I was diagnosed. I'm a very active outdoorsman. A year and a half ago, before I was diagnosed, I'd been bicycling across Argentina and across Chile. I'd been bird shooting in Africa and covering Mandela's final days in South Africa, long airplane rides to Malawi, where my wife has a project, and then home, and I had this persistent back pain. I continued my active outdoors activities by fishing throughout Montana on the Missouri River and other streams, and the back pain would not go away. So a leading orthopedist at the Hospital for Special Surgery took a look, and he said, "Tom, it's your lifestyle, L5, got a thinning of the disc, but do some exercise, I think you'll be okay." I didn't get any better, so I go to the Mayo Clinic and see the orthopedic team there. And they say the same thing. We're going to put you into some exercise programs. We don't think there's anything structurally wrong with what's going on back there. My primary care physician, I'm on the board of trustees at the Mayo Clinic, so you get assigned a doctor, and I've really bonded with this man, Dr. Micah, who is from South Buffalo, New York. And when I first told him that, of course, that was the hometown of my late departed, very dear friend, Tim Russert, he said to me immediately, "Oh, I know, the two worst things that ever happened to Buffalo were losing Tim Russert and wide right in 1991, which was the Super Bowl." And I understood completely. And on his own, he said, "We're going to take some blood, and I'm going to take a look at it, because this sounds right to me." I didn't think anything more about it. I was working on an assignment on the 50th anniversary of the death of your Boston native son, John F. Kennedy. And so I went back to the room and continued to work on that. And Dr. Micah called me and said, "Come over to the office. We've got some things we probably ought to share with you." So I went and sat in this very Spartan office of the Mayo Clinic and walked a man that a lot of people at this institution know by the name of Maury Gertz, a very brusque Chicago guy. And he sat down, called up the screen, and I thought probably I had a parasite that I'd picked up in Africa of some kind, that there was something going on. And it might as well have been the math part of the SAT test. I didn't have an idea about what he was talking about when he was going through these various numbers. And at the end, he turned and said to me, "You have a malignancy. It's called multiple myeloma." And his next line was, "You've known people who've died from this. Geraldine Ferraro died from it. Frank Reynolds died from it, the ABC anchorman. I don't think you're going to die from it, but it's a serious cancer." I've often wondered as a journalist how you react to those kinds of announcements about your life. And I learned at that moment. I had not a moment of panic. I had no moment of self-pity. My first thought was, the family's going to be okay, that I've done well enough in life, and we just had a review of our financial standing, and the kids and the grandkids are going to be fine, and somehow I'm going to have to find a way through this. So I said, 5 years, how firm is that? He said, that's a statistical thing. You're going to die of something else. We're going to beat it, because if you had to get a cancer, this is the right one to get in terms of the progress that we're making. And I went back to my room and tried to work on the JFK documentary and kept one hand on Google finding, what the hell is multiple myeloma? And what am I in for? Worked my way through the next day with a lot of MRIs and a lot of things, and I couldn't share it with my fellow trustees. And then I had to fly home to Montana. I had not called my wife. I didn't want to tell her over the telephone. It's a long way from Rochester to Montana, and a charter operator had failed me and gotten me a kind of a slow plane. So to leave Minnesota and fly across the darkened state of North Dakota and Montana with this in my mind, and then share it with my wife when I finally got to the ranch house. And we've been married for 52 years. And it's fair to say that our life has been just one big lucky break after another. First from finding each other, and then having the life that we've had. And I said, I don't know what this means. It's going to change our lives, but we'll have to prepare for it. 4 days later, they were medevacing me out of Montana because the pain had become so excruciating in my back, where it turns out I had the beginning of compression fractures in my spine, that I could barely get out of bed. And I got to Rochester, and it was the beginning of the ordeal. It was never so debilitating that I was ready to give up in any fashion. I had moments of discouragement, obviously. But I learned something from it. I learned something about what it's like to be a patient, to be in a system in which you depend on so many parts, and to be caught in a disease that is not math, that is the best guesswork that you can do based on years of research and laboratory work. And I would have to get up every morning and think this is going to turn out okay because I'm in such good hands with the Mayo Clinic and with Dana-Farber and with Sloan Kettering. But it was often very discouraging, obviously. And I quickly learned that there are those people divided into two parts. Those who are sympathetic because you have cancer and they say, gee, I'm sorry that you're going through this. And I know they walk away thinking, thank God it's not me. And for those people who get cancer, it's empathetic. The family knows what you're going through, and you know what you're going through, and you can't adequately convey that to anyone else because it is so personal that your body that you've depended on all of your life has betrayed you in some way. I would go into my living room in New York, where I would have a fire, and pre-diagnosis, I would like to get one of my history books and sit in this wonderful living room with a view of the southern part of Manhattan and read. And after I was diagnosed, I would go in and sit down, and a screen, would come over me, and I would see everything in front of me through the scrim of cancer. I wasn't paranoid about it, but it was the existence of it, and the fact that it was there, and there was not much that I personally could do about it without the help of these great physicians and the laboratory technicians, and the hope that we were doing the right thing at the right time. And as a journalist who's covered wars all over the world, and Watergate, and elections, and natural disasters, I've always had an end game. I knew when it was going to begin and probably when it was going to end. In this case, I did not. So I became, in some ways, a kind of patient advocate. And I began to talk to friends of mine who had been afflicted with various forms of cancer, and we formed a kind of brotherhood and sisterhood about what our friends needed to know. And when Jamie Dimon, the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, was diagnosed with cancer, I wrote him a short note. I said, there are two primary things that you need to know, Jamie. The first thing that you need to know is that you should get a physician friend of yours. In our case, it was our daughter, who is this renowned ER doctor who has enormous curiosity and is very aggressive about representing her family. And you set that physician off to the side, and he or she becomes your ombudsman, your advocate, someone who can interpret what you're being told and can ask the right questions and raise other pieces of research that he or she may have come across. And it's someone that you can talk to who has real expertise in the field of medicine. And they have to be the kind of people who you can rely on personally and professionally, that they're not going to race off on some tangent of some kind. And the second thing I told him was, his wife's name is Judith, you need to get one of these caring bridge sites or wellness sites so you can connect all of your friends to what's going on. Otherwise, you'll be overwhelmed with phone calls. Hey, buddy, how you doing? You know, what's going on today? Well, I don't have time to talk about. Well, you know, is there anything we can do? I mean, can I call you? No, don't call. I'm just here worrying about it. So I think all institutions, frankly, Dana-Farber, the Mayo Clinic, MD Anderson, the Hutch, all of them, need to work harder when they diagnose patients with cancer, not just on the medical piece of it, but kind of providing, if you will, a blueprint or a playbook about what you're about to go through and how to deal with that socially and with your interpersonal connections so that you can concentrate on being well. The other thing is, and of course, I'm a journalist, and I later talked to Dr. Gertz about, I said, so why did you just, step on the pedal right away and tell me everything that was going on in the first blush? I mean, there was no attempt of a bedside manner. He said, you're a trustee here and you're a journalist, I thought you could handle it. And I said, well, I was actually grateful for it, but I was curious about if that's your routine. Do you do that with everybody, frankly? And he said, no, I read all my patients differently. But I knew that you needed to know about what your condition was, and we had to get on with the job of dealing with it. I was grateful for that, and I know that most physicians, in fact, read their patients differently. But in fact, that patient-doctor relationship is so critical in the most routine cases, and it becomes even more critical when you're dealing with something as mysterious as cancer is. And it remains, as I need not tell this room, extraordinarily mysterious about how it begins, how you deal with it, how we're going to be able to get it under control at some point. And I think that physicians and technicians and hospital administrators need to have an elevated conversation with their patients about what they're in for. By the time I got back to New York and I was at Sloan Kettering, where I have friends who are on the board and I know a lot of the physicians there, they're all coming into my office, hey, you're going to be great. It's going to be great in 9 months. Well, it wasn't great in 9 months. And I was pretty sure it wasn't going to be great in 9 months. You know, they were saying you're going to be able to, you'll be out walking around, you'll be having a good time. I knew that wasn't the case. I'd done enough research on my own and talked to enough people. I didn't need to hear that. What I needed somebody to say to me was, as Ken did, it's a nasty disease. The first thing he said to me. And I needed that kind of candor. And all people who have any kind of intellectual maturity need to hear that and will be grateful for it. You don't want to push them over the edge, but you've got to have that kind of a conversation and a relationship with them, because they'll be better patients, they'll have a clearer sense of where they're going and how they're likely to get there. And it'll be very important to their family. The other thing that I learned is that cancer is not confined to the individual. It does become a family disease. And I frankly could not have gotten through this without my family. My wife, as I said, and I have been married for 52 years. In her family, there are 8 physicians. She should have been one of the doctors. Her father went off to World War II and didn't come home for 5 years, and by the time he got back, she was 6. He was a guy who had been living most of his life in a completely male combat environment, and I don't think he ever thought about encouraging Meredith to be a doctor. She was one of our brightest science students in high school, always extremely well organized. Her brothers and sisters went on to become physicians. But she became, in effect, my house doctor. She did my meds every day. She was reading the right stuff from the right places about what we were up for, and became the cheerleader. She was giving me tough love when I needed it, and she was also putting her hand up and saying, no, you're not going to do that, as well. Now, there were some amusing moments along the way as well. I was in the midst of producing this documentary for NBC on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I was going to have to promote it, and I was not in a good place at that time. So I practiced at home, walking, as if I were going on stage in the Letterman show on Jon Stewart, the Today Show. I got on the Letterman show and was fine. I called David the next day, and almost no one knew at that point, but we were so close that I felt that I had to tell him. He was stunned, and I was going to go on Jon Stewart, and I thought, I better draw the line. I can't tell John as well. I don't want it to get out. I didn't want to be another face on the internet. Brokaw has cancer. So I got to the Jon Stewart show, and the step-up was larger than the stage, and I said, you know, John, I think I have to be preceded. I've got a back issue. And he said, are you okay? I said, yeah, I've got a back issue, so just have me on the set when we come back out of the commercial. So we did. 8 months later, 9 months later, it gets out. One of the websites spots it. And they come to NBC, and we hear that Brokaw's got multiple myeloma. Actually, I think it came out of Sloan Kettering. I think there was an aid worker who got fired who leaked it out of the institution. At any rate, I get through it all fine, but now it comes out. There's this quite substantial response to it, including an email from Jon Stewart, who says to me, you are one tough SOB. I had no idea that you had cancer. And I wrote back and I said, John, there was no reason for me to trouble you with my difficulties. He instantly wrote back to me, Brokaw, you cannot be Jewish. If I had gas, I would trouble you with my difficulties. So those were the moments that kept me going, quite honestly. And I learned a lot about relationships, not just within my family, but among my friends, because I had ignored age for so long. I was always kind of youthful, whatever age I was, and jumping on airplanes and going to places and taking chances, not just in my assignments, but climbing in the American West or kayaking through the Russian Far East. And suddenly I had to acknowledge that, in fact, I was not immune to the clock ticking, that it was part of my life, and what else might happen to me, and how I wanted to live the rest of my life, and how I restore the quality of my life. So it was instructive in terms of focusing the mind on the people that you care about taking care of yourself, and then most of all, if you're given the gift of life, the resumption of your life, how do you use it wisely? How do you use it wisely, not just for yourself, but for the values that you were raised with, that you owe this country, if you've had good fortune, to give something back. And so that is a commitment that I have renewed during the course of all of this as well. Finally, I just want to share with you kind of my big take on where we all need to be as we go into the 21st century, especially in a time when so many Americans have given up that we will ever do anything right again. They're wrong. We do something right every day. The Dana-Farber Clinic is a perfect example of that. The astonishingly extraordinary success that you have in these laboratories, the people who are working right now who are not at this dinner, to improve the lives of people and save those lives. It's breathtaking. People ask me why I'm a journalist. I said it was organic medicine, organic chemistry, and algebra 2. So I'm in awe of those people who can go to those labs and develop the new chemotherapy treatments, or work in immunology, or the antibodies. That's just one example of the things that we are doing right in this country. Another perfect example is that less than 1% of our country volunteers to go into military uniform, while the rest of us, nothing is asked. And those young men and women, too many of them from working class neighborhoods, from the flinty hills of New England or the pine forests of the South or the barrios of the Southwest or the Great Plains from whence I come, they're patriots. And they go there because they want to serve their country and because it's their only out and hope of getting some kind of training, while nothing is asked of the rest of us. So I think the opportunity that we have now, whether we're physicians or journalists or businessmen, Republicans, Tea Party members, or Democrats, is to think immediately about how we reignite the core of American values, which have always been built around big ideas. In my lifetime, there have been these big ideas. We mobilized for World War II overnight, practically. People don't realize that in 1939, we were the 16th Army in the world. Poland had a greater military than we did. Dwight Eisenhower had not yet heard a shot fired in anger. And by 1944, he was commanding the greatest invasion in the history of mankind. At the end of the war, the greatest piece of civil legislation of the 20th century, in addition to the civil rights movement, was the GI Bill. It transformed this country. Millions of men came back, many of them 8th grade dropouts. And 6 years later, they're graduating from colleges and becoming physicians and lawyers and businessmen and educators. And it transformed who we are because we had a running start in the post-war years of building the country that we enjoy today. And they took advantage of it. And when Congress passed that in 1944, this country was deep in debt because of the war debts. Deep in debt. But they had the vision and the determination, Republicans and Democrats alike, to do the right thing by the veterans and especially the right thing for this country. That was a big idea. And then in the post-war years following that, your native son, John F. Kennedy, said, we're going to go to the moon before the century is out. And it unleashed this enormous pool of talent in science and technology and engineering. And the payoff from space programs alone that drove through the rest of our economy were astonishing, including medicine. At the same time, a gifted orator in a small church in Montgomery, Alabama, was chosen by his own people and especially by African-American World War II veterans who had been heroic in combat and serving in actually capacities that were well beneath their own skills, came home and said, we shall not be second-class citizens again. And Dr. King led one of the most transformative movements in the history of this country, the Civil Rights Movement. And the basis of that movement was nonviolence and a trust in the rule of law. I covered it in the South in the 1960s. And I can tell you that there was nothing more inspirational than to see young African Americans and white students that come from the North go into a fetal position as they were beaten by policemen and rednecks in those small southern towns, and then get up and march again. And it triggered a kind of moral revolution in America that spread across the industrial North as well. You had those difficult and terrible, tragic incidents here in Boston, but at the end, people emerged knowing how we had to move forward as one person, not just as one black person and one white person, that we are a country of all these colors and that we'll be better off for it. After the Civil Rights Bill passed, the next big issue, of course, was the passage of the Civil Rights Bill by Lyndon Johnson and saying to the country, we're going to make it part of the law of the land, so we'll have voting rights and civil rights acts. We had a lot of tragedies along the way as well, including Vietnam, 1968, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Dr. King himself. And then Richard Nixon was elected in 1968. Now, Richard Nixon had a lot of bad big ideas, it turns out. But in fact, he had some great big ideas. And one of them was to open relations with China, because he understood that this ancient civilization, 2,000 years old, would never stay under the iron fist of Mao Zedong, and that we would have to deal with them at some point, and it would be the best way to triangulate against Russia. That was a big idea and a bold stroke on his part, for which we are now the beneficiaries. The next big idea came from another Republican president. Ronald Reagan came determined to confront the Soviet Union with whatever it took to bring them to their knees. But then, because of the presence of Mikhail Gorbachev and the understanding that he was trying to transform that country as well, that they were able to end the Cold War without a shot being fired. That was an astonishing development when you stop and think about it. We had lived so much of our lives up to that point thinking there was a real possibility of a thermonuclear exchange that would wipe out life as we know it on Mother Earth. But in fact, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, collapse of communism in Czechoslovakia and Poland, and especially in the Soviet Union, we were able to move into a new, much more peaceful environment. There were some things we didn't anticipate, obviously. We didn't anticipate the rise of the jihadist movement in the Middle East, which is a great concern to all of us at this point. We knew that there was the possibility of a strongman coming out of Russia, and we didn't anticipate that it would be a former KGB agent who was really a driver for the mayor of St. Petersburg by the name of Sobchak. Vladimir Putin would meet Americans at the airport. A lot of them remember seeing him coming out and getting to know Americans, but we didn't know what burned in his chest was Russian nationalism. He wept all night the night the Berlin Wall came down. So we have to find another big idea of how we deal with Russia. And then, of course, the 60s came along, and everybody wondered, what are the big ideas that came out of the 60s? One that does not get enough attention, in my judgment, is the rise of feminism. At the end of the 21st century, historians will look back and say that was the most important century in the history of women in the history of the world. It is a transformative time, what we have going on now. Warren Buffett's got this wonderful line talking about the rise of women as CEOs and university presidents and physicians and administrators across the land. He says, if we've done this well so far with half the brain power, think of how well we're going to do with twice the brain power. The next big idea was homegrown, and we're just seeing the beginning of it, and that's Silicon Valley. There has never been a transformative technology as important, as wide-reaching, and as bedazzling as the digital revolution. The access that people around the world have to each other and to research and communication and exchange. They can use it for commerce, they can use it for education, and as I say, it's not just about finding where your friends are having coffee that day. It goes well beyond that. And it is beyond exciting. I don't think that we've had enough dialogue about it. But those are big ideas that came out of America. And the question is, where does the next big idea come from? And frankly, that depends on all of us. And it depends on all of us to step forward and re-enlist the citizens again and say, we're not happy with what's going on in Washington. We put the blame on both parties. I happen to believe that this last election was not an ideological revolution. I think it was a change that the voters said, you've got 2 years to get it right, and if you don't get it right, we'll have another wave. We'll find people who can get it right, who will get things done. As I go across the country, they just say, I want them to talk to each other, and I want them to deal with the fundamentals that we all know that are there. So I think the country right now is in a pivotal position of deciding which way it wants to go. Does it want to be bold and go for big ideas, or does it want to just dribble along with the petty feuds that we see playing out on cable television every day? My hope is that not just rooms like this, but across America, people will take inspiration from what you all are doing, because the war on cancer and the research that is being done and the commitment that you have as individuals to the end of the scourge is really a big idea. It is a big idea that serves your general population well, it serves science well, it serves future generations well. And that is a reward that we can all enjoy and share in. And finally, I'll share with you just one kind of parochial moment, if you will. During the worst of my cancer, which was in late November and December, when I was not doing well with my compression fractures in my back and my general well-being, I would force myself every day to get out of the apartment and walk to a coffee shop to get a bagel and a cup of coffee. And we had a terrible winter in New York, as you did in Boston, and I'd have to walk through the sleet and the snow. And there was this enormous poster of your quarterback, Tom Brady, on the bus stop. And he was looking every inch Tom Brady, staring moodily up the street in his Ugg boots. And even though I'm a Giants fan, I happen to admire him for his style and his quarterbacking skills. But I couldn't help myself. I would walk past that bus stop and look at that poster and drop the F-bomb on him and feel better for it for the rest of the morning. So I thank all of you for your extraordinary work, for your passion for what you do, for your big idea of making the quality of life better for everyone in America, including those who really can't afford the care but deserve the attention that you give to them. It's been a personal privilege for me to be here tonight. And if there's an oxymoron in American life, it is a humble anchorman. But not just having cancer, but meeting the people who are trying to deal with it has, in fact, raised my humility level a great deal. Thank you all very much.